Hello everyone, Scientier here, and today I want to do a conclusion to my Guild Wars 1 skill review project, and I'm just going to wander around pre-string while I talk about some of these things. So, in the course of doing this project, one of my goals was not only to evaluate all of the skills in Guild Wars 1 that players can equip, which I have done at this point for purposes of completing a project, but also for purposes of learning. Specifically, I wanted to learn from the design of Guild Wars 1, both its high points and its low points. And I think there's a number of really important things to learn from it. And so I've thought about it some, and I've written down a list of different things that I think are really worth taking away from this whole project in terms of learning points, things to consider, various stuff that came up over the course of doing it. I think one of the first ones that I think is really important to discuss is what is called design depth, or the depth of design space, perhaps is another way of phrasing it. And what this fundamentally is talking about is this is a game built around skills. You know, this character doesn't have very many because of where she is in the game, but it's a game built around skills, around having access to skills. And as I went through all of the skills, I mean, there was a lot of them, right? There's over 1,000 player equipable skills in the game, if I remember the numbers correctly. And what that means is that there's a design space that they're having to use to make these skills. And so what design space is referring to is kind of how many different effects you can effectively make. So as an example of this, how many skills can you make that increase attack speed? How many skills can you make that increase movement speed? How many skills can you make that inflict bleeding? And there's a bunch of different parameters. So there's going to be things like, what considerations are there when it comes to, say, making a condition removal skill, right? So we see that there's different styles of condition removal. There's the monk style of removing the condition and then either healing for removing that, healing for conditions that are left, or things like that. There's the necromancer way of transferring conditions. But there's only so many different ways you can do condition removal. And at a certain point, effects are going to start overlapping some. So a good example of this is something where Mend Body and Soul and Restore Condition start looking kind of similar. Or where the Dervish skill, Grunt's Fingers, is very similar to the Necromancer. It's kind of like Plague Touch combined with Plague Sending. They're very similar spaces because there's only so many ways that you can do these things, right? And this design space limitation, it's always going to be a thing. It's always going to be a thing in any sort of game. And in this sort of game in particular, what Guild Wars 1 is, there's limited design space in terms of the number of skill effects that you can make. And so what you have to consider when you're creating a system like this is, how are you going to use this design space? How are you going to use it effectively? Where are you going to push? Where are you going to hold back? So, for example, the design space that they were able to go into with the assassin, with lead attacks and offhand attacks and all that sort of stuff, dual attacks, this was new design space that they explored, that they created for the assassin. It was built off of some of the ideas that you could, for example, see in Warrior Hammer Mastery, where, this skill inflicts a knockdown, and then this skill does something against knockdown foes. It's very similar to some of the assassin concepts. But the assassin concepts expanded on those ideas. Whereas, the ritualist healing skills, well, there's only so many varieties you can make. A lot of them are going to end up being kind of similar to the monk skills, so how do you differentiate them? How do you make it feel like a distinct thing? Where's the overlap? Where's the difference? And all of that sort of stuff. So this is really important, and it's kind of a foundational aspect of things. And the reason why I bring it up is because I think one of the really important things about this game that maybe is not the most obvious, but there's a whole swath of intercombined things around this, and one of them is that professions are defined as much by what they can't do as by what they can do. And this is really, really important. In order to make the professions feel distinct and different, you have to identify not only what the profession is about, but identify what it isn't about. So this is something that has been talked a lot about by, say, Mark Rosewater and other developers at Wizards of the Coast when it comes to making Magic the Gathering. Because this game, Guild Wars 1, is inspired by trading card games with a lot of its design, this becomes relevant. So what this translates into is you have to, like with Magic the Gathering, for example, the colors have things that they can't do. A good example of this is red cannot destroy enchantments. The type of card, red can't do anything about it. Not in terms of destroying it. They can respond to it in other ways. Other examples are blue tends to have very limited removal of things that are on the battlefield, but it can counter stuff. White is really bad at drawing cards. So there's different things that the individual colors are just bad at. They can't do. And this is really important, basically, to make sure that everything doesn't just blend into one blob. Right? Because if every color could do anything, then there'd be no reason to play any different color, and the colors would begin to lose their identity. And this is a really important concept for this game as well, for Guild Wars 1, because the professions are kind of like the colors. It's not 100% analogous. It's not like there's a one-to-one interaction or relationship between any given color and any given profession or anything like that. I mean, you can say that Mesmer is kind of blue-like, and it is in many regards, including the overpoweredness of early blue. But the point here is that, like the colors have to have things they are deficient in order to separate themselves from each other. Not only things that they're good in, but things that they're deficient in. And it's really important here to emphasize, it's not things that they are bad at. It's things they can't do. There's a huge difference between, say, if you wanted to, saying that Dervish is bad at removing conditions from itself. It's bad at it. Grent's Fingers, Grent's Grasp, like it can, but it's not as good at doing that as, say, Ranger or Monk are at removing conditions from itself. But it can do it. And because it can do it, that means it means it opens up more options. And this is what's really important. The narrower a profession is defined, the less and the less it can overall do, the more it has to look for additional functionality in other professions, and it's secondary. And this is really important for kind of balancing the game, because if you start allowing a profession to do too much, then what ends up happening is you hit like the one thing it can't do. Well, it just goes to its secondary for, and all of a sudden you have a profession that can kind of do everything-ish. And you want to be really careful to not build that, because that becomes uninteresting, that makes that profession overpowered. I think we see a little bit of that with the Mesmer, if I'm quite blunt about it. And so it's really important to make sure you identify what can't your professions do. You know, if your monk is not really supposed to deal damage, then why invent Smiting Prayers as an attribute line in the first place? An example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, where they made the monk bad at dealing damage, not incapable of it, but they gave it just a few good skills that kind of push it up kind of over the edge for those skills. But then otherwise, the entire Smiting Prayers attribute line is just kind of bad. And it's just kind of bad because the monk is not really designed to be able to do damage with it. It's not supposed to be something it's good at, and so it's bad at it, so you just have a bunch of wasted skills. And that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. So this is really important in a number of other aspects as well. And I think one of them that's actually kind of subtle is the monetization model. So this is not something that you'd immediately think of, I suspect. But if you, like, so the monetization model for Guild Wars 1, originally as it was laid out, as far as I understood it, was that ArenaNet would create and release campaigns. So Guild Wars Prophecies is the first one. It's an example of this is a campaign, this is what a campaign looks like, and that sort of thing. And what they did is they released Factions. That was another campaign. And then Nightfall, that was another campaign. So the general model here was that every what I remember hearing is their goal was every 6 months there would be a new Guild Wars 1 campaign that would release. I mean, it's just Guild Wars at the time, right? There wasn't a sequel in the works at that point when the model was incepted. You don't go out to make a sequel to a game you haven't built yet. So anyway, this model of every 6 months, let's release a new campaign and that's how they're able to not have, because this was before the in-game store, keep in mind. So that was going to be their plan for how they weren't going to have to charge a subscription fee, a continuous income stream through selling and making new campaigns to sell. And so they would regularly have new content infusions that way. And so that was the plan, that was the model. But that model has a fundamental flaw, which is that I don't think they fully thought through or considered how they were setting up the design space for the different professions. I've heard or seen a thing later where Isaiah Cartwright, who did a lot of the skill balancing at one point in time in Guild Wars 1, in retrospect wishes that they'd done a model more like what Guild Wars 2 has done, where rather than add new professions, they've added new attribute lines. That's something that could have worked if they had planned around it, but it's still going to run into the design space issue, which is fundamentally there's only so much design space in the game, and some things are deeper than others. So, for example, energy regeneration, energy gain, there's only so much you can do with that before you kind of break things. As an example, or like the Paragon has a bunch of conditional deep wound attacks on the spear. I think there's like 5 or something of them, and it starts to get a little redundant feeling. So those sorts of things are where you can start butting into the edge of design space. And you can always try to get really creative, but then you have to understand, like, the more limitations you're placing on something, the harder it is to use. And so if you have a lot of variety of those, players are going to use the easiest one. So you would really need to split them up, and that's where you need to figure out and how you're allocating your design space. And this is where I'm talking about the monetization model. The monetization model was, as far as I understand how they were going to be putting things together, a new campaign every 6 months, probably with 2 new professions. They were going to run out of interesting, compelling design space for the professions very quickly. Like, just bluntly, there's not that much, like, identifier space. Frankly, the initial 6 professions that they made of warrior, monk, ranger, mesmer, elementalist, and necromancer were so overall broad, relatively speaking, that it was actually probably kind of hard to figure out what was the design space niches for other professions. Like, you'll see that with ritualist, they had to invent weapon skills to item spells, and these are kind of like interesting takes on enchantments, right? As well as spirits, which are kind of a variant on like necromancer minions in some regards, and ranger rituals. Like, they had to come up with, where is this design space coming from? How are we doing something different to make this distinct? And the more you go, the harder and harder it is to do that. And that's where, if you really wanted to pursue this model of releasing 2 new professions every 6 months, like, it's not a trading card game where you can just retread stuff ad infinitum, right? Like, Magic the Gathering gets away with releasing new product as often as it does, in part by virtue of having a ton of redundancy. Every set has a giant growth effect, it increases the size of a creature temporarily. Every set needs a certain critical mass of vanilla creatures, and so fundamentally it's a game that is set up in a way, and in part the rotational model of standard or draft formats or limited formats that say, oh, you can only use these cards. Those sorts of things are what facilitate that limited scope. So basically, you can't release cards into Vintage, the play every card that's ever been made format, and expect to see them have them see play. And so that's the problem that Guild Wars 1 was going to run into. How many professions could they go? Like, they're already feeling like they're starting to get themselves a bit stretched by the time they got to Nightfall. And this was something that they were aware of too, because there's other problems that occur. with adding more and more professions, the more design space you invent through things like weapon skills, item spells, or I guess it's weapon spells, but you know what I mean, the ritual stuff, or the dervish flash enchantments, or avatars, or, shouts and chants, adding chants. Like, the more of that stuff you add, the more complexity you add to the game. And that's always going to cause a problem as well. It causes a problem with making tutorials and stuff like that. So, at the outset, if you're going to be doing a game where you're expecting to be adding on content, like expansions, is kind of effectively what the Guild Wars 1 campaigns were. They were, in a way, expansions that new players could enter into. As you're adding more mechanics, you're adding more stuff you have to teach. That was a problem that they ran into. But you're also shrinking that design space. And so you have to be very intentional about saying, how are we going to address design space? And I don't think they were really thinking about that when they made Guild Wars 1. But I think it started to become a problem as they were working on it. So that's one of the really big lessons, is if your monetization model says, hey, we need to add new professions, 2 new professions every 6 months, you're going to have to figure out, how are you making new professions? How are you going to have design space for them? Like, perhaps the warrior should have been designed differently, where it didn't have 3 weapons. That's an example of the sort of thing I'm talking about here. So defining stuff more narrowly, defining your professions more narrowly, like all that sort of stuff would have been really helpful for them, because it would have allowed them to say, okay, here is what the professions do, and having a bunch of things that they don't do means that you're saving a bunch of space for future stuff, but you're still going to run into this problem eventually. It's always going to be an issue. So that's a couple of the really important big things in terms of, like, the broader design, but there's a lot of really kind of important but less large things. Again, what do you do for making things where adding new professions doesn't completely consume your design space? How are you conserving your design space? How are you parceling it out? How are you defining the professions as distinct from each other? How are you making it so that way things are not just like warrior variant number 4 or things like that? Like, to some extent, for example, the dervish is kind of a warrior variant. It's almost kind of like a warrior monk in some regards, like a warrior / smiting monk or something like that. Flavorfully, it's certainly playing in that space. And so, how are you going to address that sort of issue? How are you going to make things distinct? And one of the things that's another kind of lesson from this that applies multiple ways is defining things narrowly instead of broadly, instead of generally. And that's one of the things, too, that can help with creating a lot of skills. And so this is another, I think, kind of important lesson as we walk towards the village of Ashford here, is that it's really important to figure out niche spots to create skills. Skills that are good in some team compositions and bad in others. Good in some situations and bad in others. But not so bad that you don't have situations where you want to bring them. So, it's really important to make sure, and I think we saw this with a number of skills, that if you're designing a skill that's going to be useful in a specific situation, you've now created a skill that has percentage use, right? It's useful now, but not always. And I think this is really important because that allows you to have more skills in the game where there's intentional decisions. But you also have to be really careful doing this. This is more of a lesson from Magic in some regards, but you can see it in this game too. You have to be careful not to make skills so narrow that it's hard to bring them, or where things are like, oh, you're doing this build, you have all of these skills that you bring on this sort of build, where it's kind of like on-rails build making. So, as an example, let's say there was a bunch of skills that really cared about having spirits around. Not just in Ritualist. Ritualist has that, obviously. But let's say there was a warrior attack that was like, oh, and this attack does, plus 15 damage or whatever if you're in earshot of a spirit. And what if there was, say, a necromancer skill that was like, if you're in the earshot of a spirit, you also do this additional bonus thing. And you get the idea where, like, after a certain while, if you have enough of those skills, making a spirit build just kind of feels like, oh, I'm just supposed to bring all these skills that care about spirits. Like, you have to be careful of that, but making stuff that can be more niche, that can say, okay, we're making this sort of build, and it works better if things are a little bit more general. So, like, stuff that cares about being enchanted, for example, works really well if there are a lot of enchantments going around in your party. But maybe if you're not as heavily invested in doing stuff with enchantments, you don't use them as much. So that gives you a little bit more flexibility. But it's really important when you're making these niche skills that they are better than, in their niche situation, that they're better than using sort of the generic version. So what I mean by this is, let's say you have a skill, like let's say Heal Other was just straight up 5 energy. And it's just like, okay, well, this is the healing skill you bring. And it would kind of remove the space for some of the other healing skill options you could make. That's probably not the best example. Let's see. I'm sure I can think of one. Something like Healing Burst or Word of Healing are elites that kind of push out other healing elites just because, like, what they are good at, they are so good at that it's just kind of not worth looking at other options. And that's kind of more along the lines of the sort of thing I'm talking about. So let's see. There's also, like, Rodgort's Invocation. There's basically no reason if you're running Fire Magic to not run Rodgort's Invocation. That pushes out other variants of stuff or whatever. So it's basically like, I'm not going to bring sort of a niche skill if the non-niche version just feels superior anyway. So it would be the sort of thing where if you are making, say, what's some sort of example? Some sort of, I don't know, attack skill that gave you plus damage for, I don't know, each signet you had equipped. It would have to be noticeably better than, say, like, oh, if I just brought Executioner's Strike, that would be better than this, right? You don't want to be in that sort of situation where there's no reason to use the niche version because the generic version is just better. But Symbolic Strike is, if you have enough signets, it's going to be stronger, like 3 signets or whatever is going to be stronger than Executioner's Strike at half the adrenaline. So clearly then it becomes better, but you have to be building around it. That sort of thing. That's a good way of being able to add a lot of skills to the game because you've defined things narrowly enough that in the right circumstances, it becomes better than the generic versions, such as, say, an Executioner's Strike would be in Axe. That's kind of the generic Axe damage attack, right? But in the situation where you have enough signets, all of a sudden Symbolic Strike is good in terms of damage and half the adrenaline cost, and it becomes way better. So having some of that nicheness, but niche where it's not just always outclassed by the sort of broadly applicable skills. That's something that's also really important. A couple of other things that I have on my list here. Another one is actually being careful to avoid traps for new players. This is one that I talked about some, especially on the Monk episode with Heal Other. But you want to make sure that skills that look powerful are powerful. This is sometimes really hard to do. But usually what you kind of run into is these this 4-quadrant system, I guess you could say, where you have here's Pick and Square, by the way, if anybody hasn't seen that in pre-searing in a while. We can see that in post-searing. But you have appearance versus reality. So a skill might look weak but be strong. It might look weak and be weak. It might look strong and be strong, or it might look strong and be weak. And if it's not obviously weak when you use it, if the weakness of it is subtle, that can start causing a lot of issues. So Heal Other, the problem that I have with that skill is it's very energy intensive, and that tends to lead to issues where you just run out of energy if you use the skill too much. Like, you have to use it very conservatively if you're bringing it. because otherwise you're just going to burn all of your energy on it, because it's 10 energy. It uses up a lot of energy. And it gives you a decent amount of bang for that energy buck, but it does consume a lot of energy. So that's something that can become a trap for new players, because they don't necessarily think about the higher concept of energy management. But that means that the skill that looks strong because of its energy cost maybe isn't as strong as it looks. That becomes a trap for new players, where they maybe struggle with the game a bit more because they think the skill is better than it is. And that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. It's the sort of thing that can trip up new players and make their experience actively worse, because they're artificially increasing the difficulty of the game without realizing it by using skills poorly. And that's something that's difficult to account for, but it's something that I think is worth taking the time to try to make sure it doesn't happen. Or if you have skills that are going to be like that, you don't necessarily want to give them out at the very beginning of the game. You want to be kind of conservative about when you allow players to get them, because you want to, like, if Heal Other was introduced or first obtainable or whatever in like Drockner's Forge, that would be one thing. But if you're getting it, I am screwing up my buttons here because I'm talking. But if you're getting it, say in where I think you do get it, like super early in the game, then that can create problems, because you throw it on your bar because you only have so many skills, and then you just keep using it, and then you suddenly find yourself, for some reason, out of energy all the time. And so it's the sort of thing where understanding when you're giving new players skills and how you're giving them to them and all that sort of stuff is kind of important, is really what I'm trying to get at here. Another thing that is really, really important is what skills do you give enemies? Because enemies, they're going to have a really big impact on the experience that your players have. They define the environment that your players are interacting with. And that's really important. It's really important to take that into consideration, to consider how you are managing that environment. Because you want to be careful to make sure you're not creating an environment that's too repetitive, or basically you want to be able to create a lot of different situations that the players have to figure out how to address. Because the more situations that players have to figure out how to address, the more they're challenged, the more they're tested, the more they have to think things through. They have to come up with interesting ideas and interesting solutions. Because if there's no death penalty in pre-steering, by the way, if they always have the same situation that they're going into, if they are, or if they're not confronted with very specific things, then certain skills just don't have a purpose, don't have a use. So, as an example, there's not necessarily a ton of areas in the game that use, say, a lot of minion-based strategies. And it's hard for the AI to use those strategies anyway, but there are ways that you could kind of try to get those to work. But if you have those situations, if you have those sorts of scenarios where they're working, all of a sudden you have a counter strategy that can come up. And players may want to consider using certain skills to directly address minion usage. And so thinking through what are the effects that you want to encourage the player to have to bring or to think about or whatever, like that's a good thing to do, because it creates that backdrop. So one of the things that I think Guild Wars 1 kind of failed at is that, especially in the standard game, it just has too many areas that are too similar, where there's just not enough variety in what the enemies do, in enough ways that make the players have to think about, okay, how are we approaching this situation? How could we be changing things to more specifically address this, and to be more effective at dealing with these issues, with the threats that we're going to encounter here? And, you know, it's just, there's a lot of area where you need to make sure you're balancing things on a curve and all that sort of stuff. But it's an important consideration of how are you managing some of that stuff? How are you making sure that the players are appropriately challenged and have to test their build-making skills and react to kind of what's going on, all that sort of stuff. So that's a really important part of this. And I think one of the things that kept coming up in the skill review project is I'd be like, well, here's a skill that's really useful for dealing with a scenario. Now, you wouldn't really use it because the AI doesn't really use this sort of thing very much. You don't encounter this scenario. And that, unfortunately, has the side effect of, especially in a PvE context, it basically means that you're not incentivizing the use of certain classes of skills or certain types of skills. And that is unfortunate, I think. There's a lot that could be done to sort of increase that. The swath of skills that players want to use by adjusting, what skills the enemies are using to encourage the players to use a broader variety of skills. So that's something that I think is... Certainly with Guild Wars 1, I feel that the teams that worked on the Guild Wars Beyond content in particular, so that would be War and Kryta and Winds of Change and Hearts of the North, technically as well. They did a much better job of creating interesting build compositions for the enemies to use, and in particular, also creating builds that can counter stuff the player does. And that brings me to another thing that's really important, is just counter strategies. Having skills that can act as release valves. This is referring to a concept in Magic the Gathering, where certain cards would function as a, quote, release valve, unquote. And this would mean that if a particular thing got to be too strong, more powerful than the developers thought it would be, that people could bring this card to kind of counteract it. So an example of this would be something like Grafdigger's Cage. This is a card that prevents players from being able to interact with certain zones of the game that can become quite powerful. An example of that for Guild Wars 1, and I talked about this extensively during the Monk episode, is the Monk skill Withdraw Hexes. Hex play can be really powerful. Hexes are, generally speaking, kind of difficult to remove. You have to bring dedicated skills for it, obviously, just as you do with conditions. But hex removal skills tends to be longer in recharge, I think is the biggest thing going on there with them. That longness of recharge, that sort of lengthy duration relative to condition removal. So, for example, Remove Hex is one of the fastest recharging hex removal skills, especially non-elite, at only 8 seconds to recharge. A lot of the hex removal skills are more like 12-ish, give or take. So sort of that range is where you expect them to be. So then something that, versus condition removal, that's often like 2 to 5 second recharge, right? Condition removal and condition application is easier, of course, but condition removal just recharges more quickly on average. By the way, during the opening cutscene, I think King Adelburn is up there. And this is Ascalon City over that way, for anybody who was curious. But anyway, what this means is that something like Withdraw Hexes so it's a skill that removes all hexes from party members in a pretty big area of effect, and then increases its recharge for each one it removes. This makes it take forever to recharge if it actually does its job of removing a lot of hexes. Now, all that skill is good for is removing hexes, and it's an elite, so you're really dedicating a lot to it. But what that means is, if they set up the game to where you basically have to bring if they set up an area where you really want to bring hex removal, I should say, where there's a lot of hexes going on, then all of a sudden something like Withdraw Hexes, if it had sort of the opposite effect, where its recharge shortens for each hex that it removed, would suddenly be super attractive. And so there's just all of these considerations of how are you setting these things up? How are you designing your skills, I should say. That way your counter skills are good choices for countering the things you're trying to stop. I'm going to get in way too deep if I keep going that way. So that's sort of some of the stuff you want to think about and consider. Okay, well, we're going to wander back this way. but I over-aggroed there. But anyway, so that's something that's also really, really important, and a really important lesson. A lot of the more interesting skills to me in this game, in terms of like buildcraft stuff, there's the importance of build around me's, which I've talked about, like sort of the niche skills. Well, build around me's are skills also that you kind of like. This goes into a specific strategy, so something like Warrior's Endurance that allows a warrior to gain energy when they hit with an attack. That can be used to build, say, a dagger build on a warrior, which ordinarily they couldn't have the energy for. But also having the counter play strategy skills, I think that's a really important part of the game, because it means that if you're going into certain areas, maybe you need to be able to counter this specific strategy, so you want to bring the skills to be able to do that. And making sure that your counter strategy skills are good enough to actually bring, and there's different reasons why you'd want to bring different ones at specific times, is I think something that's really useful to do. And I think kind of the ultimate failing of Withdraw Hexes is that they introduced the skill Divert Hexes, which is another elite, in order to deal with the problem that Withdraw Hexes could have dealt with if it had been designed to do so. But it wasn't. So that's most of what I wanted to talk about. I think that covers a lot of it, honestly. Yeah, and I already mentioned making sure that you don't make broadly applicable skills that can invalidate niche skills too easily, or in other words, making sure your niche skills in the right situation can be more powerful, or having the powerful build around me's. I also want to comment on the elite skill system. I really like that system in that I think it does a really good job of adding an additional aspect to making builds. It does have the downside of making people think they always have to bring in an elite, and that's not true, but usually you should. But I like that system. I like the stuff that it does because it adds an additional facet to Buildcraft. But I think overall, this is kind of like the major list of lessons. So just to recap, going through my list, these were kind of written in the order that I kind of was thinking about them. So the importance of nicheness of skills, so making skills that have specific niches that they fit into, is really important. By the way, for anybody who's curious about the area, this is part of the Great Northern Wall mission. You'll run down here, and then down this way and over this bridge to get back to Captain Calhoun. So that's where this area is. The next one is counter strategies and release valves. This is something that's really important. It's a concept that shows up in Magic the Gathering and is highly applicable to the sort of game that this is as well, and is something that I think they could have spent a bit more time focusing on. But they certainly did some amount of it. There's just a few examples of skills that are kind of should be in this space but aren't. And so it's making sure that your counter skills actually function as counter skills. Build around me's are important to have, so I mentioned that. Those are skills that specifically are ones that you want to build around, that are good for a specific strategy, and they enable strategies, but they're not something you want in every build, right? They're not generically powerful, they're specifically powerful. And they're specifically powerful in, say, this strategy or that strategy or things like that. Those skills are really important to have because they allow you to open up more design space. They allow you to have more skills without, in a way that's less combative, unless you make the strategy overwhelmingly dominant somehow. Having more variety in what your skills do in a narrow sense, the build around me sense, which is very much so related to the niche skill thing I was mentioning, does do a lot to open stuff up. I don't think I talked about on that one quite as much, so I wanted to make sure I was clarifying it. And then this one was really important. Professions are defined as much by what they can't do as they are by what they can do. Yeah, that was just really, really, really important. This is the opening and the ending of the Great Northern Wall mission, by the way. So that's the door you come back in on. And this is where you fight the Devourers at the start. So I think it's kind of fun coming here. There's an invisible wall here, but up there leads up to where Captain Calhoun is. So, and then there is... planning around your monetization strategy is important. So their monetization strategy was releasing 2 new campaigns a year. That's 4 professions. That's very limited design space that they're going to have to work with, and you need to design around that limited amount of design space. You need to plan around it. And one of the things I think was a real problem for Guild Wars 1 long term, or would be if they had gone on longer than Eye of the North. By the way, this is the entrance to Ascalon City post-searing. And Ascalon City in post-searing actually takes place in this lake, interestingly enough. And like over there is where you get up to Sir Titus and all that sort of stuff. That leads to the arena. So, interesting little detail here. Let's go ahead and chill out here, shall we? Enjoy pre-searing spot. So, anyway, planning around your monetization strategy is important. So a game where you're planning on releasing a lot of expansion content that will add to existing content, like Guild Wars 1 did, you need to be really, really careful about how you're handling your design space, how you're managing it. That's really, really important to plan around, just for the long-term ability to create new stuff for the game, and new stuff that's compelling in ways that isn't just making things more powerful. You want to manage power creep as much as you can, and that's an important aspect of it. On the other hand, if you were making just a standalone game where you're not really planning on doing any expansion content, at least in terms of adding a bunch of skills or like straight up new professions, then you need to figure out how you're allocating your design space according to that. So just be aware of how you're going to be monetizing things and how that's going to impact how you need to distribute your design space and all of that, so that way you can have room for everything. And then to be careful to avoid new player traps. So this is making skills, or it's not just making skills that might confuse new players as to how good they are in terms of they think that the skill is better than it is, and so, or they use it incorrectly. It can also go to things like addressing certain topics like energy management more explicitly, as well as just identifying when you give new players skills. Usually you want to give new players simple, generic, powerful skills. And when I say powerful, I don't necessarily mean like the most powerful skills. I mean skills that are strong enough to like be fine, but lack the power of synergy. Usually, and this is not one that's on my list, but it's a great lesson from Magic the Gathering that applies to games like this as well. Usually you want to focus your power not in raw power, but in synergy power, to where things work together to be stronger than the sum of their whole. And that sort of thing, that sort of setup is really important for creating those niche skills, for creating those build around me's, creating situations where by itself the skill ain't great, but as part of this combination of skills, it becomes stellar and stand out and very powerful. And having those sorts of strategies is really good for sort of late game, but you want the simpler, easier to understand, more straightforward skills that you're giving to your new players as well. And you want those skills to be like serviceable. You want them to be adequate in the truest sense of the word, where this is fine. It is not the most powerful thing you can be doing, but it is fine. And it's really important that those are the sorts of skills you're giving early, ones that will be competent, that don't have hidden play traps and stuff like that. And I think this game suffered a little bit from giving skills that are maybe a little bit harder to actually use well, or that require a bit more nuanced play, like something like Heal Other, a little too early. Healing Breeze is another example of a skill that's can be decent, but is maybe not as powerful as people might initially think as well. So just being careful about some of that stuff. And then this is another one that's kind of related to some of those things I was talking about synergy, which is just be careful with broadly applicable skills. They can easily invalidate niche skills. So something like Spirit Light is an incredibly powerful ritualist heal. That kind of makes you uninclined to bring other ritualist healing skills. You certainly are probably bringing Spirit Light just because it is so powerful. And that kind of can invalidate some of the more niche skills that ritualists can use for healing. There are other examples, something like Eviscerate is just raw effective enough that it kind of makes it hard to use other Axe Elites. Or, let's see, Signet of Spirits is a really strong example. That skill is just so raw powerful that it's hard to kind of bring other stuff. That's kind of a more aggressive version of it, but there can also be simpler versions or lower versions. So, like, let's say maybe you don't want to bring a certain fire magic spell because there's just there's just Rogwar's Invocation, right? Why would you bring, say, lava arrows? So here's actually an interesting example. So there's lava arrows which shoots out 3 projectiles, and then flare has had the added functionality that if you have overcast, it's area of effect. Well, a lot of the times that area of effect on flare plus its recharge is probably going to be better than the lava darts, lava arrows, whatever it is. So there's a lot of things where you can kind of create problems that way. Basically, be careful about what you're making good and how that's going to interact with other things and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it's a lot of the balancing stuff, but if you want to make it so that way you have niche skills that can show up and be useful, you have to make sure that the niche skills can be more powerful in their synergy situations than just this more straightforward, more broadly applicable skills. Because otherwise, everybody's going to bring the broadly applicable skills instead of putting in the effort to get more out of the system if it doesn't feel like it's worth it. And then finally, and this one's really important, what enemies do is massively important. Players will make builds in response to enemy builds. So as a game designer, you are creating the environment. What environment are you creating? What are you encouraging players to do? How are you setting all of that stuff up? And enemy builds are really important to that. So that's the recap. So these are, I think, some really important lessons that we can learn from this. And I've certainly learned a lot. I think hopefully it shows. And it's been a good exercise for me. So I hope my sharing it with you has been useful to you as well. So until next time, everyone, next Saturday, we'll talk about something probably other than Guild Wars. Although it might crop up. We'll see. Anyway, thank you for joining me on this massive project, this massive endeavor to review all of these skills. And until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.